Sarah pressed her face against the cold window of the coffee shop, watching the storm clouds gather over the small mountain town. The weather forecast had warned everyone about the approaching tempest, but she hadn't expected it to arrive so quickly. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and the first fat raindrops began to splatter against the glass. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders and checked her phone again. No messages. David had promised to pick her up after a shift, but that was 3 hours ago. Her calls went straight to voicemail, and her texts remained unread. The familiar ache of disappointment settled in her chest like a heavy stone. "Storm's getting worse out there," called Marcus from behind counter. He was wiping down the espresso machine with practiced efficiency, his dark eyes occasionally glancing her way with concern. "You sure you don't want me to give you a ride home?" Sarah shook her head, forcing a smile. "David will be here soon. He's probably just running late because of work." The lie tasted bitter on her tongue. She knew David wasn't coming. He never did when she really needed him. Marcus had been working at the coffee shop for 6 months now, ever since moving to town from Denver. He was quiet but kind, always making sure her cup was full during her long study sessions. Unlike the other guys who frequented the place, he never made her feel uncomfortable or tried too hard to impress her. There was something steady about him, something reliable that she found both comforting and unsettling. "Sarah, I hate to say this, but we need to close up," Marcus said gently. "The storm warning just got upgraded. They're telling everyone to get off the roads." She looked around the empty coffee shop, realizing she'd been so lost in her thoughts that she hadn't noticed the last customer leave. The wind was picking up outside, rattling the windows and sending loose papers dancing down the street. Her car was parked 8 blocks away at David's apartment, and she had no way to get there without walking through what was quickly becoming a dangerous storm. Marcus finished cleaning and grabbed his keys from under the register. "Come on," he said, pulling on a heavy jacket. "I'm not leaving you here alone." "I can't ask you to do that," Sarah protested, but her voice was weak. The truth was, she was scared. Not just of the storm, but of going home to David's apartment where she'd have to pretend everything was fine, where she'd have to smile and act like his absence didn't hurt. "You're not asking. I'm offering." Marcus held the door open for her, his expression determined. "My truck can handle the weather better than walking can." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. As they stepped outside, the wind immediately whipped her hair across her face and sent a chill straight through her jacket. Marcus placed a protective hand on her back, guiding her toward his old blue pickup truck parked just outside. The interior of the truck was warm and smelled like pine air freshener and something distinctly masculine. Marcus started the engine and cranked up the heat, then looked at her with those steady dark eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable with. "Where to?" he asked. Sarah gave him David's address, then settled back in the passenger seat. The radio crackled with weather updates and road closures. The storm was moving faster than anyone had predicted, and several highways were already impassable. As Marcus navigated the increasingly treacherous roads, Sarah found herself watching his hands on the steering wheel. They were strong hands, calloused from years of outdoor work before he'd taken a coffee shop job. Hands that looked like they could fix things, build things, protect things. "Tell me about Denver," she said, needing to fill the silence with something other than her racing thoughts. Marcus glanced at her briefly before focusing back on the road. "Not much to tell. Worked construction there for 5 years after high school. Good money, but the city never felt right to me. Too many people, too much noise. When my grandfather left me his cabin up here, it seemed like a sign. You have a cabin? About 10 miles up the mountain. Off-grid mostly. Solar power, wood stove, well water. It's not fancy, but it's peaceful." He paused as a particularly strong gust of wind rocked the truck. "Might be where we're heading tonight, if this storm gets any worse." Sarah's phone buzzed, and her heart jumped, hoping it was David. Instead, it was her sister texting about the weather. She typed back quickly, then stared at the blank screen, willing David's name to appear. "He doesn't deserve you, you know," Marcus said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth and possibility. Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "You don't know anything about my relationship. I know you've been waiting for him to show up for 6 months. I know you make excuses for him every time he disappoints you. I know you deserve better than someone who leaves you stranded in a storm." Sarah wanted to argue, to defend David, but the words wouldn't come, because Marcus was right, and they both knew it. David was charming and handsome and could make her laugh when he wanted to, but he was also selfish and unreliable and made her feel like she was always asking for too much. The truck hit a pothole hard, jarring them both. Outside, the storm was intensifying rapidly. Tree branches whipped back and forth in the wind, and the rain was coming down so hard the wipers could barely keep up. Marcus slowed down, leaning forward to peer through the windshield. "Can't see more than 20 feet ahead," he muttered. "This is getting dangerous." As if to emphasize his point, a large branch crashed down onto the road just in front of them. Marcus slammed on the brakes, and the truck skidded to a stop mere inches from the obstacle. Sarah's heart was pounding as she stared at the massive piece of wood blocking their path. Marcus put the truck in park and turned to her. "We're not making it to David's place tonight. That branch is too big to move, and there are probably more coming down. We need to find shelter." Sarah pulled out her phone to call David to let him know where she was, but there was no signal. The storm had knocked out the cell towers. A part of her felt relief at not having to explain herself, not having to apologize for something that wasn't her fault. "The cabin," she said. "Can we make it there?" Marcus nodded, already turning the truck around. "It's closer than town, and I know these back roads like the back of my hand. We'll be safe there." As they drove deeper into the mountains, Sarah felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. She was heading into the unknown with a man she barely knew, leaving behind the life she'd built with David. It should have terrified her, but instead, she felt more alive than she had in months. The cabin appeared through the trees like something out of a fairy tale. It was small and rustic with a covered porch and warm light glowing in the windows. Marcus parked as close to the front door as possible, then looked at her with concern. "Ready to make a run for it?" Sarah nodded, and they both jumped out of the truck. The rain immediately soaked through her thin jacket, and the wind nearly knocked her off her feet. Marcus was beside her in an instant, his arm around her waist, pulling her against his solid warmth as they ran for the porch. Once under the protection of the roof, they both stopped to catch their breath. Sarah was dripping wet and shivering, but she was also laughing. There was something liberating about being caught in the storm, about being forced to abandon all her careful plans and just survive. "Come on," Marcus said, unlocking the door. "Let's get you warmed up." The inside of the cabin was even more charming than the outside. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The furniture was simple but comfortable, and everything had a lived-in quality that spoke of care and attention. It felt like a home in a way that David's modern apartment never had. Marcus immediately went to build up the fire while Sarah stood dripping in the entryway. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how inappropriate this all was. She was in a relationship, even if it wasn't a good one. She had no business being here, alone with Marcus, feeling the way she was feeling. "There's some dry clothes in the bedroom," Marcus said, not looking at her. "My sister left some things here last time she visited. You should change before you catch pneumonia." Sarah found herself in the small bedroom, staring at a pile of soft flannel shirts and warm sweaters. She peeled off her wet clothes and pulled on a thick wool sweater that smelled faintly of lavender. In the mirror above the dresser, she looked different somehow. Her hair was wild from the wind, her cheeks flushed from the cold and excitement. She looked alive. When she emerged from a bedroom, Marcus had made hot chocolate and was standing by the fire. He'd changed into dry clothes too, and without his coffee shop apron, she could see the lean strength in his shoulders and arms. He handed her a steaming mug, and their fingers brushed, sending electricity up her arm. "Better?" he asked, his voice low. "Much." Sarah settled into the chair across from him, but She felt the distance like a physical ache. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, everything was warm and safe and perfect. They talked through the night, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Marcus told her about building furniture in his spare time, about his plans to expand the cabin, about the peace he found in working with his hands. Sarah found herself opening up in ways she never had with David, talking about her abandoned art degree, her job at the bookstore that she actually loved, her dreams of traveling to places where she could paint the landscape. "Why did you give up art?" Marcus asked. Sarah stared into the fire, considering the question. David said it wasn't practical. Said I needed to focus on something that would actually pay the bills. "What do you think?" "I think I've forgotten how to dream," she whispered. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and disappeared into another room, returning with a sketch pad and charcoal pencils. "Draw something," he said, setting them in front of her. "I can't. It's been too long." "Draw the storm," he said simply. "Draw how it feels." Sarah's hands were shaking as she picked up the charcoal, but as soon as it touched the paper, something inside her awakened. She drew the wind made visible, the trees bending and breaking, the raw power of nature unleashed. But she also drew the cabin, small and steady in the chaos, a beacon of warmth and safety. When she looked up, Marcus was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're gifted," he said quietly. "Don't let anyone tell you that's not worth something." The power went out just as she was finishing the sketch, plunging them into the soft glow of firelight. Marcus lit some candles, and the cabin became even more intimate, even more removed from the outside world. Sarah was acutely aware of his presence, of the way he moved with quiet confidence, of the way he looked at her like she was something precious. "I should call David," she said, even though she knew there was still no signal. "Should you?" Marcus asked, and there was no judgment in his voice, only genuine curiosity. Sarah thought about David, probably asleep in his warm bed, not even wondering where she was or if she was safe. She thought about all the times he'd disappointed her, all the ways he'd made her feel small and unreasonable for wanting more than he was willing to give. She thought about Marcus, who had driven her through a dangerous storm and given her shelter and reminded her who she used to be. "I don't know," she admitted. Marcus moved to sit on the arm of her chair, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "You don't have to know tonight," he said. "Tonight, you're safe. Tonight, you can just be." The fire popped and hissed, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, but inside the cabin, time seemed suspended. Sarah looked up at Marcus, at the gentle strength in his face, at the way the firelight played across his features. "I'm scared," she whispered, "of the storm, of this, of how I feel when I'm with you, of what it means." Marcus reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch so gentle it made her breath catch. "You don't have to be scared," he said. "I would never hurt you." Sarah believed him. In the 6 months she'd known him, Marcus had never been anything but kind and respectful and genuine. He was nothing like David, who was all flash and charm but no substance. Marcus was solid, real, a man who kept his promises and showed up when it mattered. "What do you want, Sarah?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. What did she want? She wanted to feel cherished instead of tolerated. She wanted someone who would drive through a storm to keep her safe, who would encourage her dreams instead of crushing them, who would see her as she truly was and love her for it. She wanted to feel alive again, to remember what it was like to hope for something better. She wanted Marcus, but admitting that felt like jumping off a cliff, like abandoning everything she'd built her life around. Even if that life wasn't making her happy, it was familiar, predictable, safe in its own dysfunctional way. The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature itself was demanding an answer. Sarah closed her eyes and made a choice that would change everything. When she opened them, Marcus was still watching her with infinite patience, waiting for her to find her courage. "I want to feel like I matter," she said finally. "I want to feel like someone would move heaven and earth to keep me safe. You do matter, Marcus said fiercely. You matter more than you know. The space between them crackled with electricity that had nothing to do with the storm. Sarah could feel herself falling, could feel the careful walls she'd built around her heart beginning to crumble. Marcus was everything she hadn't known she was looking for, everything she'd convinced herself didn't exist. The fire burned lower as the night wore on, but neither of them moved to add more wood. They were content to sit in the growing darkness, talking quietly about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories, building something fragile and beautiful between them. When Sarah finally fell asleep in the chair, Marcus covered her with a soft blanket and settled onto the couch nearby. He stayed awake, watching over her, listening to the storm rage outside, and knowing that everything had changed. Tomorrow, they would have to face the real world again, but tonight, in this small cabin with the woman he'd been falling for since the day she first walked into the coffee shop, everything was perfect. Sarah slept deeply for the first time in months, dreaming not of David or obligations or shoulds, but of strong hands building beautiful things, of art supplies waiting to be used, of a life where she was valued for who she was instead of who someone else wanted her to be. In her dreams, the storm was not something to be endured, but something to be celebrated, a force of nature that had brought her exactly where she needed to be. Sarah woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then, it all came rushing back, the storm, Marcus, the choice she'd almost made in the firelight. Her cheeks burned as she remembered the way she'd looked at him, the things she'd said. She was still in the chair by the fireplace. The blanket Marcus had covered her with soft against her skin. Through the window, she could see that the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and bright. Tree branches littered the ground, and the road was barely visible under debris, but the sun was shining, and the air looked crisp and clear. "Good morning," Marcus said from the kitchen area. He was standing at the stove, his hair slightly messy from sleep, wearing a flannel shirt that brought out the warmth in his dark eyes. He looked domestic and comfortable, like he belonged in this space he'd created. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, sitting up and trying to smooth her hair. "I didn't mean to fall asleep. You should have woken me up. You needed the rest." Marcus brought her a cup of coffee, steam rising from the dark liquid. "Besides, you look peaceful. I didn't have the heart to disturb you." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. The morning light made everything from the night before seem less intense, more manageable. In the daylight, she could pretend that the electricity between them had been her imagination, that the way he'd looked at her had been simple kindness. "Is your phone working?" she asked, reaching for her purse. Marcus nodded toward the window. "Cell tower's back up as of about an hour ago. I checked the road conditions, too. Main highway's still closed, but the back roads should be passable by this afternoon." Sarah pulled out her phone and saw 17 missed calls from David and a string of increasingly frantic text messages. Her stomach dropped as she read them. He was angry, demanding to know where she was, accusing her of ignoring him deliberately. Not once did he ask if she was safe or express concern for her well-being. Marcus must have seen the expression on her face because he moved closer, concern creasing his brow. "Everything okay?" "David's been calling all night," she said quietly. "He's upset that I didn't come home." "Did you explain about the storm?" Sarah scrolled through the messages again, her heart sinking with each accusation and demand. "I don't think he cares about the storm. He thinks I stayed out all night on purpose." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then returned to the stove where bacon was sizzling in the pan. "What are you going to tell him?" "The truth, I guess." But even as she said it, Sarah knew the truth was more complicated than a simple explanation about weather and car trouble. The truth was that she'd spent the night talking with another man, feeling more connected and understood than she had in her entire relationship with David. The truth was that she'd almost kissed Marcus by the firelight, and part of her wished she had. Her phone rang, David's name flashing on the screen. She answered reluctantly, stepping toward the window for privacy. "Where the hell have you been?" David's voice was sharp, angry. "I've been calling you all night." "There was a storm," Sarah explained, keeping her voice calm. "The roads were closed. I had to find shelter." "Where?" "I drove by the coffee shop this morning, and it was closed." "Your car isn't in the parking lot." Sarah's throat went dry. Of course he'd checked the coffee shop. Of course he'd noticed her car was missing. But she realized with a start that his first instinct had been suspicion, not concern for her safety. "A friend gave me a ride," she said carefully. "When we couldn't get through because of the storm damage, he offered to let me stay at his place." David's voice turned cold. "What friend?" "You don't have any male friends." "Marcus, from the coffee shop." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Sarah could practically hear David processing this information, building his case against her. When he spoke again, his voice was low and dangerous. "You spent the night with another man." "It wasn't like that. The roads were impassable. He was being kind." "Kind?" David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right. And I'm supposed to believe nothing happened." Sarah felt anger flare in her chest. "Yes, you're supposed to believe me, because I've never given you any reason not to trust me. Unlike you, who couldn't even be bothered to pick me up from work like you promised." "Don't turn this around on me, Sarah. I got held up at the office." "That's completely different from spending the night with another man." "Is it?" The words were out before she could stop them. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you only care when it's convenient for you. You leave me stranded, but God forbid I accept help from someone else." Marcus glanced over at her, clearly hearing the tension in her voice. He turned off the burner and moved to the living room, giving her space while still staying close enough to intervene if needed. The gesture was subtle but protective, and Sarah felt a wave of warmth for his thoughtfulness. "I'm coming to get you," David said. "Where are you?" "You can't. The roads are still damaged. Marcus is going to drive me back when it's safe. I don't want that man anywhere near you." "You don't get to decide that," Sarah said, surprising herself with her firmness. "You don't get to ignore me when it suits you and then control me when it doesn't." David was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted to the tone he used when he was trying to manipulate her into feeling guilty. "Baby, I'm sorry I couldn't pick you up yesterday. You know I would have if I could. But can you understand how this looks? How would you feel if I spent the night at some woman's house?" The old Sarah would have crumbled at that tone, would have apologized, and made excuses for his behavior. But something had shifted during the night. Maybe it was the way Marcus had listened to her dreams without dismissing them, or the way he'd given her art supplies and encouraged her to create. Maybe it was simply seeing how differently she could be treated, how it felt to be with someone who put her well-being first. "I would trust you," she said simply, "because that's what people do when they love each other." "I do love you," David said quickly. "You know I do. That's why this is so hard for me. If you loved me, you would have been worried about me last night instead of angry. If you loved me, you would be grateful that someone kept me safe instead of jealous that it wasn't you." "Sarah, you're not thinking clearly. This guy is obviously trying to manipulate you, trying to come between us. Can't you see that?" Sarah looked across the room at Marcus, who was quietly tending the fire, giving her privacy while making sure she felt supported. She thought about David's words, about manipulation and ulterior motives. But everything about Marcus spoke of genuine care and respect. He hadn't pushed her toward anything, hadn't taken advantage of her vulnerability. He'd simply been there when she needed someone to be there. "I have to go," she said to David. "I'll call you when I get back to town." "Sarah, wait." She hung up and set the phone on the table with shaking hands. Marcus looked up from the fireplace, his expression carefully neutral. "How did that go?" "About as well as expected." Sarah sank onto the couch, suddenly exhausted. "He's angry and suspicious and convinced you're trying to steal me away from him." Marcus sat down beside her, close enough to offer comfort, but far enough to respect her space. "Am I?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities and consequences. Sarah looked at him, at the honest concern in his eyes, at the way he waited for her answer without trying to influence it. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know anything anymore." "That's okay. You don't have to know everything right now. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire crackle and listening to the sounds of the forest awakening after the storm. Sarah felt like she was standing at a crossroads, with one path leading back to her familiar but unsatisfying life with David, and the other leading into unknown territory with Marcus. "Tell me about your art," Marcus said eventually. "When did you start drawing?" Sarah smiled, grateful for the change of subject. "I was probably 5 or 6. My mom bought me a box of crayons, and I covered every surface in the house with pictures. She was so mad, but my dad just laughed and bought me a sketchbook." "What did you love about it?" "The way I could make something beautiful out of nothing. The way colors could express feelings I didn't have words for. The way time just disappeared when I was creating something." Sarah's voice grew wistful. "I used to dream about having my own studio, about painting murals that would make people stop and feel something." "What's stopping you?" "Life. Responsibilities. Reality." "David." Sarah looked at him sharply, but there was no judgment in his expression, only understanding. "It's not that simple, isn't it? You have talent, you have passion, you have dreams. The only thing standing between you and pursuing them is fear, and money, and time, and the fact that David thinks it's a waste of energy." "David doesn't get to decide what your dreams are worth," Marcus said gently. "Only you do." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. When was the last time someone had talked to her about her dreams, as if they mattered? When was the last time someone had encouraged her to reach for something bigger instead of convincing her to settle for less? "I'm scared," she admitted. "What if I'm not as good as I think I am? What if I try and fail? What if you try and succeed?" Marcus countered. "What if you don't try and spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been?" The bacon Marcus had been cooking earlier was getting cold, but neither of them seemed to care. They were building something here, something fragile but real, made of honesty and possibility and the kind of understanding that Sarah had never experienced before. "David wants me to come home," she said quietly. "What do you want?" It was such a simple question, but Sarah realized that no one had asked her that in years. David made decisions and expected her to go along with them. Her family gave advice based on what they thought was best for her. Her friends offered opinions colored by their own experiences and biases, but no one ever just asked what she wanted. "I want to stay here," she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I want to pretend the outside world doesn't exist for just a little while longer. I want to draw and talk and figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be who everyone else needs me to be." Marcus smiled, and Sarah's heart did a little flip at the warmth in his expression. "Then stay." "I can't. I have work tomorrow and obligations, and David expects a lot of things that aren't necessarily good for you," Marcus interrupted gently. "When was the last time you did something just because you wanted to, not because someone else expected it?" Sarah couldn't remember. Every decision in her life had been filtered through other people's needs and expectations. Her job, her relationship, her abandoned dreams, they had all been shaped by what was practical, what was expected, what would keep peace instead of what would make her happy. "I have vacation days saved up," she said slowly. "I could call in sick to the bookstore." "And David?" "David can wait for an explanation until I figure out what I want to say to him." Marcus stood up and held out his hand. "Come on, let me show you the rest of the property." Sarah took his hand, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers. He led her outside, where the air was crisp and clean, washed by the storm and bright with morning sunshine. The cabin was nestled in a clearing surrounded by tall pines and aspens, with a small creek running along the eastern edge of the property. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed, taking in the peaceful scene. "I've been thinking about building a workshop over there," Marcus said, pointing to a level spot near the trees. "Maybe a studio space too, with big windows for natural light." "For what kind of work?" "Whatever needs creating. Furniture, art, music. I play guitar sometimes, though not very well." Marcus looked at her sideways. "Maybe painting if the right artist needed a space to work." Sarah's pulse quickened. He was offering her something that David never had: the belief that her dreams were worth pursuing, the space to explore them, the support to take risks, and maybe fail, but maybe succeed wildly. They walk along the creek talking about books and music and places they wanted to travel. Marcus told her about his plans for the property, about his dream of living simply and creating things with his hands. Sarah found herself sharing thoughts and ideas she'd kept buried for years, talking about art techniques she wanted to try and subjects she longed to paint. "There's something else I want to show you," Marcus said, leading her up a small hill behind the cabin. At the top, they emerged into another clearing, this one with a spectacular view of the valley below. Sarah gasped at the sight: mountains stretching into the distance, morning mist clinging to the peaks, the town visible as a small cluster of buildings far below. "This is where I come when I need to think," Marcus said, "when the world gets too complicated and I need perspective." Sarah turned in a slow circle, taking in the panoramic view. "It's like being on top of the world. You could paint this," Marcus said quietly. "You could capture this feeling and share it with people who never get to see something this beautiful." Sarah closed her eyes and imagined herself here with an easel and paints, trying to capture the way the light hit the mountains, the way the mist softened the harsh edges of the rocks. For the first time in years, she could see herself as an artist again, not just someone who used to draw. When she opened her eyes, Marcus was watching her with an expression that made her breath catch. There was admiration there and desire, but also something deeper. Something that looked like the way she'd always dreamed someone would look at her, like she was worth treasuring, worth protecting, worth believing in. "Marcus," she started, but he held up a hand. "I know this is complicated," he said. "I know you're with David, and I'm not trying to pressure you into anything. But I need you to know that what I feel for you isn't casual or convenient. I've been falling for you since the first day you walked into that coffee shop, and last night just made me realize how much I want to be the man who keeps you safe, who encourages your dreams, who makes you smile the way you did when you were drawing." Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Everything she'd been afraid to want was standing right in front of her, offering itself freely with no conditions or expectations beyond her happiness. "I'm scared," she whispered, "of me, of this, of how right it feels, of what I'll have to give up if I choose you." Marcus stepped closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "You wouldn't be giving anything up, Sarah. You'd be choosing something better. You'd be choosing yourself." The wind stirred the trees around them, sending leaves dancing through the air like confetti. Sarah thought about David, about the life she'd built with him, about the comfort of familiar patterns even when they didn't make her happy. Then she thought about Marcus, about the way he saw her potential and nurtured it, about the feeling of being truly known and valued for who she was. "What if I'm not brave enough?" she asked. "You're the bravest person I know," Marcus said. "You've been settling for less than you deserve for years, but you never stopped dreaming. That takes incredible courage." Sarah looked out over the valley at the endless possibilities stretching toward the horizon. Somewhere down there, David was probably calling her phone again, getting angrier by the minute. Somewhere down there, her safe but unfulfilling life was waiting for her to return. But up here with the man who had seen her heart and chosen to protect it, she felt like she could do anything. She felt like she could paint the whole world if someone just gave her the chance. "I want to try," she said, turning back to Marcus. "I want to be brave enough to choose happiness over safety." Marcus smiled, and Sarah thought it might be the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. "Then try. Start with one day, then another, then another. You don't have to change your whole life at once. Just choose yourself, one moment at a time." Standing there on the hilltop with the storm-washed world spread out below them and endless blue sky above, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest. It felt like waking up, like coming alive, like remembering who she'd always been underneath all the compromises and concessions. It felt like the beginning of everything. 3 weeks had passed since the storm changed everything, and Sarah still felt like she was living someone else's life. She'd moved her things out of David's apartment the day after returning from the mountain, enduring his anger and accusations and desperate attempts to convince her she was making a mistake. The hardest part hadn't been his fury, but the moment when his mask had finally slipped completely and she'd seen the cold calculation underneath his charm. "You'll never find anyone better than me," he'd said, standing in the doorway as she packed the last of her art supplies. "You think this mountain man is going to take care of you the way I have? You think he actually cares about you? Or is he just enjoying the novelty of stealing another man's girlfriend?" Sarah had looked at him then, really looked at him, and realized that in 3 years together, he'd never once asked what would make her happy. He'd told her what she should want, what was practical, what made sense for their future together. But he'd never cared about her dreams, her needs, her heart. He'd seen her as an accessory to his life, not as a person with her own desires and ambitions. "You're right," she'd said quietly, sealing the box of sketchbooks and charcoal pencils. "I will never find anyone better than you, because I'm not looking for someone to take care of me. I'm looking for someone who wants to build a life with me, not for me." Now she was living in a small studio apartment above the bookstore where she worked, surrounded by canvases and art supplies and the smell of oil paints that she'd missed more than she'd realized. Marcus had helped her move, carrying boxes and offering quiet support without pushing her toward any decisions about their relationship. He seemed to understand that she needed space to figure out who she was on her own before she could figure out who she might be with him. The bookstore had been surprisingly understanding when she'd asked for reduced hours so she could focus on her art. Mrs. Chun, the elderly owner, had smiled and told her that she'd been waiting years for Sarah to remember what made her eyes light up. She'd even agreed to display some of Sarah's paintings in the store windows, creating an impromptu gallery that had already attracted several interested buyers. Sarah was working on a new piece when the bell above the bookstore door chimed, signaling a customer. She was painting the storm now, trying to capture the wild energy and raw power that had changed her life. But she was also painting the cabin, small and warm against the chaos, and she was painting herself in the doorway, no longer running from the storm but standing strong in its path. "Excuse me," called a voice from below. "I'm looking for the artist who did the painting in the window." Sarah wiped her paint-stained hands on a cloth and headed downstairs, where a middle-aged woman in an expensive suit was studying the mountain landscape Sarah had completed the previous week. It was the view from Marcus's hilltop, painted during one of their walks together, trying to capture the feeling of infinite possibility that came from standing above the world. "I'm Sarah," she said, extending her hand. "I painted that." "It's extraordinary," the woman said, shaking her hand enthusiastically. "I'm Rebecca Walsh from the Riverside Gallery in Denver. I was driving through town and saw this in your window, and I had to stop. Do you have more work?" Sarah's heart jumped. The Riverside Gallery was one of the most prestigious art spaces in Colorado, known for launching the careers of emerging artists. She dreamed about showing her work there when she was in college, but it had seemed impossibly out of reach. "I have several pieces upstairs," she said, trying to keep the excitement out of her voice. "Would you like to see them?" Rebecca followed her up to the studio, where canvases lined the walls in various stages of completion. There were landscapes of the mountain town, portraits of the coffee shop regulars, abstract pieces that captured the emotional journey of the past few weeks. But it was the storm series that drew Rebecca's attention, the paintings that showed destruction and renewal, chaos and beauty, fear and courage all existing in the same space. "These are powerful," Rebecca said, studying the largest canvas. "There's something visceral about them, something that makes me feel like I'm experiencing the storm myself." "How long have you been painting?" "Seriously?" "About 3 weeks," Sarah admitted. "I studied art in college, but I stopped creating for several years. I'm just getting back into it." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. 3 weeks? You've created all this in 3 weeks?" Sarah nodded, suddenly self-conscious. Maybe the work wasn't as good as she'd thought. Maybe she'd been fooling herself about her abilities. "That's remarkable," Rebecca continued. "Most artists take months to produce this much work, especially pieces with this level of emotional depth. What inspired this particular series? Sarah looked at the paintings, remembering the night that had started it all. I got caught in a storm, she said simply. It changed everything. Rebecca spent another hour looking at the work, asking questions about technique and inspiration, taking notes in a small leather journal. Finally, she turned to Sarah with a smile that made her knees weak. I'd like to offer you a solo exhibition, she said. These storm paintings, plus whatever else you can create in the next 2 months. We could open in January, right after the holidays when people are looking for something fresh and inspiring. Sarah stared at her, certain she'd misheard. A solo exhibition. 20 pieces, if you can manage it. We'll handle all the promotion and sales, take our standard commission. I think these could really resonate with people, especially the way you've captured transformation and renewal. There's something hopeful about them, even in the midst of chaos. After Rebecca left with a signed contract and a promise to stay in touch, Sarah sat alone in her studio, staring at the paintings that had emerged from her heart like they'd been waiting there all along. She thought about David's voice telling her art wasn't practical, wasn't worth pursuing, wasn't going to pay the bills. Then she thought about the check Rebecca had written for 3 of the pieces she wanted to display immediately, more money than Sarah made in 2 months at the bookstore. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. How did the meeting with the gallery owner go? Sarah smiled, remembering how excited he'd been when she'd told him about Rebecca's visit. He'd encouraged her to show everything, to be confident in her work, to believe in her talent the way he believed in it. I got a solo exhibition, she typed back. 20 pieces. Opening in January. Her phone rang immediately. Sarah, that's incredible. Marcus's voice was warm with pride and joy. I knew it. I knew someone would see what I see in your work. I can't believe it's real, Sarah said, sinking onto her couch. 2 months ago, I thought I was done with art forever. Now I'm going to have my own exhibition at one of the most respected galleries in Colorado. You deserve this, Marcus said firmly. You deserve all of it and more. Are you free for dinner tonight? I want to celebrate properly. Sarah felt a flutter of nerves mixed with anticipation. She and Marcus had been spending time together regularly, taking walks, having coffee, talking about everything and nothing. But they'd been careful to keep things light, to give her space to heal from her relationship with David and figure out what she wanted. Tonight felt like it might be different. I'd love that, she said. Marcus picked her up at 7, looking handsome in dark jeans and a button-down shirt that brought out his eyes. He brought her a small bouquet of wildflowers, the kind that grew around his cabin, simple and natural and perfectly suited to who she was becoming. These are beautiful, she said, breathing in their sweet scent. Thank you. Not half as beautiful as you, he said, then looked embarrassed at his own boldness. Sorry, I didn't mean to. Don't apologize, Sarah said, touching his arm. I like it when you say things like that. David never did. Marcus's expression darkened slightly at the mention of her ex-boyfriend. David had been calling and texting for weeks, alternating between anger and attempts at reconciliation. Sarah had finally blocked his number the previous week when he'd shown up at the bookstore demanding she stop this ridiculous phase and come back to him. Have you heard from him lately? Marcus asked as they walked to his truck. No, and I hope it stays that way, Sarah said. I realized I was never really happy with him. I was just comfortable, and I mistook that for love. Marcus held the passenger door open for her, a small gesture that David had never bothered with. What does love feel like to you now? Sarah considered the question as Marcus drove them toward the edge of town, where a small Italian restaurant overlooked the valley. Like support instead of judgment. Like encouragement instead of criticism. Like someone believing in my dreams, even when I don't believe in them myself. Like painting storms instead of hiding from them, Marcus added softly. Exactly like that. The restaurant was warm and intimate, with checkered tablecloths and candles flickering on every table. They ordered wine and talked about Sarah's upcoming exhibition, about Marcus's plans for expanding his property, about books and music and the changing seasons. But underneath the conversation was a current of attraction and possibility that had been building between them for weeks. "I have something to show you," Marcus said as they shared tiramisu for dessert. He pulled out his phone and scrolled to a photo of architectural drawings. "I started designing that studio we talked about, the one with the big windows for natural light." Sarah studied the sketches, seeing the careful thought he'd put into every detail. The studio faced east to catch the morning sun, with a small kitchenette and bathroom attached, so she could work for hours without interruption. There was even a small loft area for storing canvases and supplies. "Marcus, this is amazing," she said, but her voice was uncertain. "But I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm offering." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. "Sarah, I've been trying to give you space to figure things out, but I can't pretend anymore that I don't know how I feel about you. I'm in love with you. I love your talent and your courage and the way you see beauty in everything around you. I love that you choose hope over fear, even when it's hard. I love that you make me want to build something beautiful with my hands, just so you'll have somewhere beautiful to create." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. No one had ever loved her like this, with such awareness of who she really was, and such determination to help her become everything she could be. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I've been falling for you since that first night in the storm, when you gave me shelter and reminded me who I used to be." Marcus smiled, the same smile that had made her heart flip that first morning in his cabin. "So what do we do now?" "Now we build something together," Sarah said, squeezing his hand. "Something beautiful and strong enough to weather any storm." They drove back to Marcus's cabin that night, and Sarah felt like she was coming home for the first time in her life. The place looked different in the darkness, cozier and more intimate, with warm light spilling from the windows and the sound of the creek babbling nearby. Inside, Marcus built up the fire while Sarah looked at her sketch from that first night, the one she'd drawn of the storm and the cabin standing strong against the chaos. It seemed like a lifetime ago that she'd been that frightened, uncertain woman hiding from her own desires. "I used to think storms were something to survive," she said, settling beside Marcus on the couch. "Something to get through and forget about as quickly as possible. And now I think there's something to embrace. Something that clears away everything that's not strong enough to last, so you can see what really matters." Marcus pulled her closer, and Sarah melted into the warmth of his arms. This was what she'd been searching for without knowing it, the feeling of being cherished, supported, encouraged to be her best self instead of a smaller version that was easier to manage. "The way you never did," she whispered against his neck, remembering the title that had started this whole journey. "What?" Marcus asked, pulling back to look at her. "David never embraced me the way you do. Never supported my dreams. Never made me feel like I was worth fighting for. You do all of that without even trying." Marcus cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that had escaped. "You're worth fighting for, Sarah. You're worth everything." When he kissed her, it was like coming alive, like every nerve ending in her body waking up after a long sleep. This was what she'd been missing, what she'd convinced herself didn't exist, the feeling of being completely known and completely accepted, desired for exactly who she was rather than who she could become with enough changes. "Stay with me tonight," Marcus murmured against her lips. "Not because of the storm this time, but because you want to." "I want to," Sarah said without hesitation. "I want to stay with you tonight and every night after. I want to paint your mountains and build a life in your studio and grow old watching sunrises from your hilltop." Marcus laughed, spinning her around until she was breathless with joy. "Is that a yes to moving in with me?" "It's a yes to everything," Sarah said. "To love and art and taking chances on happiness. To choosing myself and choosing you and choosing the life we can build together." Outside, winter's first snow was beginning to fall, soft flakes drifting past the windows like blessings. Sarah watched it through the glass, thinking about cycles and seasons and the way beautiful things often emerge from periods of darkness and cold. 6 months ago, She'd been trapped in a relationship that diminished her, convinced that dreams were luxuries she couldn't afford, afraid to want more than the life she'd settled for. Tonight, she was in love with a man who saw her potential and nurtured it, about to embark on an art career that filled her with excitement and purpose, living authentically for the first time in years. "What are you thinking about?" Marcus asked, following her gaze to the snow-covered landscape. "Transformation," Sarah said, leaning back against his chest. "How sometimes you have to let everything fall apart before you can build something beautiful from the pieces." Marcus wrapped his arms around her, solid and warm and absolutely certain. "Are you afraid?" Sarah considered the question, thinking about the exhibition that would either launch her career or crush her dreams, about the new life she was building with Marcus, about all the unknowns that lay ahead. She thought about the woman she'd been that night in the storm, terrified of disappointing people, convinced that her dreams weren't worth pursuing. "No," she said, surprising herself with how true it was. "I'm not afraid anymore. I'm excited." The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney like tiny shooting stars. Snow continued to fall outside, covering the world in pristine white, offering the promise of a fresh start. In the morning, Sarah would begin preparing for her exhibition, pouring everything she'd learned about courage and transformation and choosing love over fear onto canvases that would hang in one of the most prestigious galleries in the state. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of a man who had seen her in the storm and chosen to offer shelter, not just from the weather, but from all the voices that had told her to be smaller, quieter, less ambitious than her heart demanded. Tonight, she was the artist she'd always dreamed of being, the woman she'd always wanted to become, the person who had finally learned that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is play it safe. "Embrace me now," she whispered, turning in Marcus's arms to face him fully, the way he never did. And Marcus did embrace her with his whole heart and both hands, and a love that promised to weather any storm that might come. He embraced her dreams and her courage and her wild, beautiful heart that had finally found its way home. He embraced all of her completely and without reservation, the way she'd always known love should feel but had never dared to hope she'd find. Outside, the storm of snow continued, transforming the landscape into something magical and new. Inside the cabin, by the warmth of the fire, two people who had found each other in the chaos began building something that would last long after the snow melted and the seasons changed again. They were building a love story that would inspire Sarah's art for years to come, a partnership that would support dreams and weather difficulties and prove that sometimes the most beautiful things emerge from the wildest storms. They were building a life together, one choice at a time, one canvas at a time, one moment of courage at a time. And it was going to be extraordinary.